It had already been 2 hours since Sarah was wheeled into the delivery room. Her contractions were now frequent, but the midwife was still nowhere to be found. Sarah noticed the worried expressions on the faces of the nurses and doctors, sensing that something was wrong. Her mother-in-law, Esmeralda, decided to take matters into her own hands, unaware of the consequences it would bring to the family. Despite the rising tensions, Sarah understood she couldn't blame Esmeralda entirely. The whole experience had left everyone in the room on edge, their nerves frayed from the prolonged anticipation. Fine, she heard Esmeralda, her mother-in-law, who had been breathing down one of the nurses' throats earlier, intoned from the side. I'll do it myself. And that's when everything went south. Sarah could remember the week she learned she'd be having a child. It had started with a day like any other, and she and her husband, Robert, were just about to have breakfast. The telltale morning sickness accosted her, and an oblivious Sarah thought she'd eaten something bad to warrant such a reaction from her body. But she'd soon learn that it was something else. Sarah and Robert had always wanted to have a big family. They talked about it even before they tied the knot. For months, they tried to have a child, but the world had turned a deaf ear to their pleas. Although none of them admitted it, they were slowly losing hope. That was until that fateful day Sunday morning. Sarah had a slice of toast when her stomach sent up everything she had that morning and the night before. She tore to the bathroom, Robert quickly after her. Are you okay? He asked, his face darkened with worry. Sarah nodded. She'd knelt before the toilet bowl. Might have been the snacks from the pantry, she theorized. She should have known her life was about to change forever. After a few minutes in the bathroom, the nausea that had taken over her body let up. Sarah got up and cleaned herself before returning to her morning routine. She still had errands to attend to and chores to do. A little sickness wouldn't put her down. She had no clue that this would be a daily thing. The next day was a Monday, and the couple woke up early, ready for work. But just as Sarah was setting the table for breakfast, her stomach grumbled as nausea took over. But this time, she didn't sprint to the bathroom, even though she could feel burning liquid rush up her throat. She stared blankly at her husband. She knew exactly what was happening. I think I'm pregnant, she whispered, afraid to even utter the words. She didn't want to jinx it. Really? Robert jumped up, rushing to her. Yes, Sarah answered as hope fled her body. Her eyes grew wet, but she couldn't cry. Not now. She needed to confirm the pregnancy before fully giving in. If only she knew it would end in a disaster. Sarah and Robert had a few pregnancy tests in their bedroom. After half an hour spent tending to Sarah's morning sickness, the hopeful mom-to-be took the test. She held her breath as she and Robert waited for the test to mature. The minutes were grueling, and the two couldn't stop pacing in their bedroom as they peeked at the test. I think it's done, Sarah said and hurried to the pregnancy test. With bated breath, she snatched it from the sink and handed it to Robert. She couldn't look at it. With her fingers against her lips and her eyes wide, she stared at him. The air was tense with tension, the room itself waiting on Robert's answer. But even he couldn't speak. Robert dashed forward, sweeping Sarah into his arms and hugging her tightly. He placed hundreds of kisses all over her, thanking her over and over again. She just made him the happiest man in the world. Sarah looked at the test. 2 lines she mouthed, her tears finally falling free. That means positive. After months of trying, she and her husband have finally done it. Life couldn't be more perfect. The two took another test just to be sure and then drove to the hospital for a checkup. They were pleased when the doctor confirmed that they were indeed expecting a child. Sarah called her parents and siblings while Robert called his. They also shared the news with their friends, letting everyone know that God had finally answered their prayers. But their joy would soon turn into heart-wrenching pain. The pain came from one person, Robert's mom and Sarah's mother-in-law, Esmeralda Keys. The woman was angry and offended because Robert was the one to tell her Sarah was pregnant instead of Sarah herself. Bubbling with anger, she called Sarah, telling her she didn't appreciate the treatment. Sarah couldn't understand the woman's point of view. She should have known that this was only the beginning of this issue. Esmeralda and Sarah had always had a good relationship. Esmeralda loved that Sarah had found the perfect balance between housewife and career woman. She loved how Sarah carried herself and adored that she made Robert happy. You know, she'd said once, I've never seen him look at anything or anyone the way he looks at you. So why would she be so cross now? Esmeralda felt she and Sarah were very close, more than just a typical mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. So hearing about Sarah's pregnancy from Robert instead of Sarah hurt her feelings. You'll pay for that, she said one evening with a grim expression. Sarah thought Esmeralda was joking until the day of delivery. 9 months passed quickly, filled with care from everyone around her, especially Robert, who went out of his way to make her feel loved. He couldn't wait to be a dad. When the time came, Sarah and Robert rushed to the hospital. Their baby boy was ready to be born. They informed friends and family, and despite her contractions, Sarah called Esmeralda to share the news. The nurses wheeled Sarah to the delivery room, and Robert joined her after completing paperwork. He was surprised to see his mom, Esmeralda, in the room. Sarah didn't mind. She hoped this experience would bring them closer again. If only she had known what her mother-in-law was planning to do. The nurses set everything up, and an uncomfortable silence fell over the delivery room as everyone waited for the midwife to come. But soon enough, it became clear that something was wrong. For an hour, the nurses rushed in and out of the room, whispering in hushed tones and trying not to look worried. They kept glancing at Sarah and Robert, too. What was happening? Hey, is everything okay? Robert asked the doctor, following him out. Esmeralda remained in her corner, as quiet as she'd been since she arrived. A few more minutes passed with nothing else happening, but Sarah's contractions were getting much harder to bear. Spikes of pain hit her after every minute, and she couldn't stop gritting her teeth. Why weren't the medical practitioners helping her? Sarah let out a shriek as the pain became too much. She'd been very patient since she got here, following every instruction the nurses gave her, but she couldn't take it anymore. Her contractions were getting more frequent. She wondered why they weren't telling her to push yet. That's when her mother-in-law took matters into her own hands and paid the ultimate price. Esmeralda stepped forward, taking off her jacket and rolling up her sleeves. She dashed to the sanitation tray and cleaned herself before hurrying to her daughter-in-law. With a serious look, she said, "I think it's time, honey." Sarah nodded. "It is time," she said, stamping down another shriek. Sweat had already drenched her body. "I think it's time, too." "I'm going to need you to push," Esmeralda said as she positioned Sarah. "Give it your all." Following the woman's instructions, Sarah started pushing. She felt like her body was no longer hers. Constant ticks of pain thrummed all over her, and her mind was on fire. She could barely see clearly. "Push," her mother-in-law commanded. "Push," Esmeralda shouted, and that's when the doctor and nurses barged in. "No, no," the doctor cried out, assessing what was happening. "What have you done?" The light-headed Sarah watched as the doctor, utterly horrified, stared at her body. She leaned in and let out a foreign curse, turning around with a hand on her forehead. "What's wrong?" Sarah stammered. "What's happened?" Her body still pained her, and her mind was still on fire. But worry had washed away all the pain and agony. Esmeralda, who had been confident before, stepped back, broad-eyed and shaking. She slumped on a seat lining the room's wall. What had she seen that would cause such a reaction? "What's wrong?" Sarah asked again, summoning enough energy to shout out the words. The doctor looked up at her and said, "You weren't ready yet." There were a few unforeseen complications. She seemed to snap herself into reality, seemingly noticing she was supposed to act professionally and get the situation under control. That's when she did the unthinkable. The doctor asked Esmeralda to leave the delivery room, and in a shocking turn, Esmeralda agreed. But Sarah wouldn't let that happen. She held a hand out for the woman and begged the doctor to let her stay. "Doctor," Sarah asked with Esmeralda by her side, "you said there were complications. The pain is too much. But for my son, I can take it. Tell me what's happening, please." The doctor gave a smile and said, "I don't know how we missed it, but you are expecting 2 boys, Sarah. But the condition of the second one is not as stable as the first. That is why we couldn't start the delivery. We were still trying to find the best way to deliver both infants without endangering their or your life. But it seems we are out of time." The midwife and nurses stepped in with a plan as the doctor was speaking. They involved Esmeralda in the process, and after 16 exhausting hours, 2 babies were born. Esmeralda was the first to hold them. Henry, a healthy boy with his dad's eyes and mom's strong voice, and Esma, a beautiful girl who spent her first week in an incubator but soon grew strong. Robert and Sarah took their babies home, relieved and grateful. Despite the rocky delivery, Sarah appreciated her mother-in-law's intervention, knowing it came from a place of love.